Well, Favor, this episode today is a slightly challenging one in many ways. It's about what happens when we set out and intend to do good. We try and push international best practice, and things don't play out the way we intended. Uh, what are your thoughts when you think about the guest we have lined up today and the topic? What are your initial thoughts on that?
So, as both an idealist and an optimist, I think today's episode was quite hard because it invited us to address a really uncomfortable truth that sometimes the ideals that we want to uphold may not be readily available to us in the immediate. And that was, I had to come face to face with this discussion. I'm like, oh, I actually see where our guests are coming from. Not that I actually see what he's saying is the reality. And it's now a matter of taking a step back and saying that, just like we often say, sometimes two things can be true. And I think this was an episode that really signified that.
Yeah, I think it makes it more hard hitting, knowing that when I first met Tobias, it was in Islamabad. He'd been evacuated from Afghanistan just after the Taliban had taken over. And so this stuff is not just academic and theoretical and conceptual, although it does draw on a very rich academic literature that supports it. But it's also based on Tobias's lived experience. And I know it would have been a very unsettling, even traumatic time for him and others who were having to be evacuated from Kabul, local colleagues that were under threat, under risk at that time from the Taliban takeover. It was a very difficult time for all concerned. I got to see some parts of that from being based in Pakistan at the time, where a lot of people were evacuated to, and it was a really tough period. So this is not just academic. This is not just philosophical. This is really a reality that's played out, and I think the insights that Tobias brings in the interview will be very insightful. So rather than going into too much detail now, why don't we hear from Tobias himself as he talks about some of these very hard realities?
Hello, Tobias. Thank you so much for joining us on the Flywheel Economics Podcast. We're really excited about this conversation. So, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here. My name is Tobias Haque. I'm a lead country economist with the World Bank, currently in Pakistan, but I've been working in development for nearly 20 years now, which is a little bit frightening. But yeah, I'm coming from a background in both economics, but also sociology and political science, working in many different countries, and really, I think, interested most of all in the interactions between economics and broader institutions and society. So really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me again.
Thanks, Tobias. Before we get into stuff about your work, stuff about the book that you've written, we first met in Islamabad after some rather challenging circumstances in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over. You had previously been based there. Can you tell us a little bit about that period of time and how that sort of linked into some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, no, so I've been working on Afghanistan on and off from 2016, right up till the fall of the Republic in 2021. Working on economic reform, public finance reform, and been living in Kabul for several years, on and on. So obviously, I mean, I think that whole process of watching the Taliban take over, watching how quickly the Republic collapsed, was very traumatic, I think, for many of us, both in terms of the human costs and watching the consequences of that roll out, people that we knew very well, people that we worked with, even just from the pure human scale of what was happening was very shocking. And I think it has. I mean, I think it really has influenced how I think about development and economics, and it certainly influenced the way I thought about the story I was telling in the book. I think that in some ways my career had been always involved in fragile states or states with very weak institutions. But I think Afghanistan and that experience in Afghanistan showed just how frail formal institutions can be in the face of real power politics organized violence of different kinds. Really, you couldn't have found a better illustration of how irrelevant a piece of legislation or a regulation can be when the deputy prime minister is a warlord and has access to his own coercive violence and has access to his own streams of patronage and rent flows, and just how those two systems of real power-based politics interact with the formal systems of economics that we are much more used to and much more familiar with. I thought was very, very interesting, and certainly has influenced how I think. And I think probably the other part of it that I took from that experience was just the extent of humility and the importance of humility and the exercise of development. I think that just the scale of what the international community was trying to do in Afghanistan was absolutely enormous. It was a 20-year effort. It was hundreds of billions of dollars, possibly trillions of dollars. And at the end of it, the lasting sustainable impact we made on development outcomes, I think, was very large and very tangible. Right? A lot of lives were improved. But in terms of the impact, in terms of how social systems and political systems worked and overall systems of democratic accountability, I think those impacts were much, much less. And I think in many ways were much different from what we had expected. So I think it really showed me that, yes, development can work in even the hardest places, but large-scale social re-engineering is an entirely different question.
Thank you, Tobias. I think that was really humbling, as you said. Thank you very much for sharing with us. So, you had referenced your work, and I want us to go deeper with that conversation. I know that you talk about the critical analysis of the good governance agenda in fragile states. So, for our listeners, what is the single biggest misconceptions that economists like yourself and development agencies hold about applying standard market-based reforms in conflict-affected contexts?
No, thanks for that. It's a big question, and I think maybe I can begin by just very briefly outlining the argument. And this is a very kind of simplistic version of it, obviously, and I think it's very important to note that this is not my argument necessarily. In all of my work, I'm drawing very heavily on the work of Douglas North and his limited access order framework, and also Mushtaq Khan and his political settlements framework. So I want to kind of put that up front, right? A lot of what I'm doing is applying these theoretical concepts that have actually been around for many years, and I'm surprised have not had a deeper and more sustained impact on the way that development economics is done. But yeah, the basic argument is that in contexts and countries where you have very weak institutions, where there isn't a neutral state, a leviathan, if you like, that has the power to enforce laws, enforce contracts. If you don't have that state that exists above elites, above individuals, and regulates and neutrally imposes the law, the only way that you can sustain social order is through having bargains between elites. Right? Essentially, you have people with the ability to mobilize coercive violence, and they agree not to mobilize coercive violence for as long as they feel that they are benefiting from the distribution of economic benefits within that settlement. So if I'm a warlord, I may be happy to allow the government to continue to operate and hold sovereignty as long as I have access to the gold mines and I have access to the state-owned enterprises that employ my friends and family. If my access to those resources is threatened, then my calculus may change and I may become much more willing to use the coercive forces at my disposal to challenge the state. And it's not just one warlord, it's dozens of warlords and dozens of warlords that depend upon dozens of militias. And the way that social order is actually achieved when you don't have a powerful neutral state is these interlocking bargains between powerful elites and powerful actors. And the critical point from an economist's perspective is that those bargains are very often underpinned by rents, what we call rents in economics. And that is the extraction of value beyond what would be expected from normal productive profits. Right? So using the power of the state, using protection rackets, using privileged access to natural resources to extract economic value. And that extraction of economic value then becomes the resource that you can use to strike bargains. So if you're the state, you need access to economic rents, whether that's from taxation, whether that's from aid, whether that's from offering regulatory privileges or trade privileges or access to state-owned enterprises. You need that access to rent, not necessarily because you're greedy, not necessarily for your own personal benefit, but because you need a stream of patronage with which to placate those actors that may threaten you. Right? You need to be able to resource the bargain that holds the state together. Now, from a political perspective, that makes some sense. I think the risk when economists see this is all they see is rents and economic distortions. Because we know whenever a rent is being extracted, there is deadweight loss, there's resource misallocation. The market is not being allowed to function correctly. Right? So if I'm a government that is extracting resources from state-owned enterprise to pay off a warlord, that state-owned enterprise is probably not optimizing its profit-making behavior. It is probably charging too much for the services that it's providing from a social welfare perspective, from a narrow economic social welfare perspective. But the bargain depends upon the ability of elites to extract those rents. So quite often, I think what you see is a conflict between economic prescriptions, which is to eliminate the rents, make sure that everything is based on acceptable levels of profit, make sure that the distortions are being removed. But that means that there's less rent available within the system for that purpose of stabilization. Right? So that's the core argument. And I think that, this is the core misconception that economists bring, is that rent extraction or economic distortions serve no purpose other than greed, and are necessarily socially damaging. In many cases, yes, there is an efficiency cost from having rent generation, but there might be a much broader stabilization or stability benefit from having a system in which those with the access to coercive force have an incentive to sustain the stability of the system. If you don't have stability, you don't have anything. So making sure that there's enough resource available to underpin the bargains that are required for stability in many ways might be even a higher value than economic efficiency.
Thank you, Tobias. I mean, I remember a national business plan competition we ran with the Ministry of Finance in Nigeria alongside the World Bank, and it was trying to reach all parts of the country, including the very conflict-affected northeast of the country. And they would give out these big grants for basically capital for the businesses to use however they saw fit based on a business plan. And we were looking and monitoring results to see how things would go. And we were really proud that we had the conflict-affected northeast there. We were reaching parts of the country where others were scared to go. But then down the line, you'd have situations where you just get news that, the business, everyone was slaughtered in the business. It's no longer operational and things. And it just, it was absolutely really tragic and shocking stories you would get back. But it just underlined just how, without that stability, without that basics that we need to be able to function in life, you can't get that growth and you can't get that development. And it's so essential. And I suspect that speaks quite starkly to the point that you've been trying to make as well. I will just go in and say, you point out that the policy literature doesn't provide a distinct framework for economic reform under conflict, right? So why do you think it's tempting for economists like ourselves, institutions like the World Bank, IMF, bilateral donors, all the rest of it, to simply treat these contexts as slightly harder versions of normal development? Why is it, do you think, that we haven't got this subtle, this, it's not, not even sure it's a subtlety. Why haven't we got this distinction in terms of the basic underlying stability?
Yeah, no, thank you, Rich. I think that's a very good question. Let me react as well. And I think your little vignette from Nigeria is really instructive, right? And it just reminds me as well. There was some analysis done in the World Bank's World Development Report on institutions, and I think it was 2011, but I have to check that. That basically was looking at income differentials between countries, and really was showing that the countries that have high incomes are not necessarily those that have grown by 1 or 2% per annum faster each year. Of course, that's part of it. But the big distinction was the countries that have avoided massive destabilizing wars or political instability. Right? So the costs of political instability and conflict are much more significant in the long run than eking out another 1 or 2% of GDP growth. And we as economists tend to focus on that 1 or 2% of extra GDP growth, sometimes, I think, at the expense of thinking what happens if the whole apple cart gets tipped over the process. So I think I totally agree with your framing there. And I think that this question of why are economists sometimes blind to this, I think there's a distinction to be had between economists working in the field, who I think implicitly do recognize a lot of this and build this into their thinking and build this into their discussions with counterparts and colleagues. There's this, I guess, almost a kind of informal way of doing economics that I really think does take some of these considerations into account when you look at development practice on the ground. Where I think it falls down is when you look at formal policy documents or program documents. And as you said, you very rarely see this recognition of that kind of framework or that kind of thinking in what we say in formal contexts. It's almost like we feel we're not allowed to talk about the reality, and we have to talk in this very narrow, technical sense about these issues and almost wish away the big picture political underpinnings. I wonder if some of that comes from a historical fear of development agency being seen as interfering in politics or even having a view of politics. Maybe there's a bit of a hangover there. I mean, I think recently political economy has become a real part of development thinking. But I wonder if there's just still a bit of an institutional hangover. I think some of it is just about transferability and communicability. I think if you write a program document that says we're going to improve economic efficiency, we're going to improve allocation, we're going to improve public transparency, that immediately resonates and translates to a very broad range of stakeholders in a way that saying, look, here's a very specific country context with a very specific set of problems, and we are going to try and carefully navigate this using a very specific set of interventions. It's less immediately appealing. It's less immediately eligible, I think, for the people sitting in headquarters or sitting in capitals that are authorizing the funds. So I think there is a bit of an incentive for us to simplify and tell cleaner stories than the realities of development as it's actually practiced. And then finally, I think standardization plays a big role as well. And perhaps this is a subcategory of the point that I just made. But I think it's much easier to roll out a program or a project that looks the same and is designed in the same way as a project that was recently rolled out in another country. It's faster, it's communicable, it's reduces the transaction costs involved. New York University, they put out that report on public financial management, the working group, a couple of years ago that really talked about this, right? Why we see this standardization in reform programs and approaches. And it brought together this idea of communities of practice and communities of experts, and how there is this incentive within technical expertise, with people sharing the same technical expertise to reach for the same solutions and reinforce each other and promoting or providing very standardized solutions. So I guess there's a bit of a sociological element to this as well.
Thank you very much, Tobias. So, in your previous answer, you mentioned the tendency for economics to only think about these market extortions as market extortions. But when do you think that economists can be able to practically identify when a rent generating mechanism is serving a useful social purpose versus when it is purely extractive? And what questions should they be asking?
Yeah, no, I mean, and that is the question, right? I think in many ways. And look, I don't think it's easy. I think that this is what I think comes out of a lot of recent development work, right? And I think for the past 2 decades now almost, right? We've been talking about the importance of context. We've been talking about doing development differently. We've been talking about political economy analysis. We've been talking about political settlements analysis. All of this discussion over decades really has said to development practitioners, you need to understand the context in a lot of detail. You need to understand who the players are. You need to understand the elite incentives. You need to be able to think through what the consequences may be of disrupting rent flows or pushing through economic reforms that will lead to significant resource reallocations. And I think that the kinds of questions that the development practitioners ask and should ask is really about, whether any particular reform will lead to a resource reallocation and what the impacts of that reallocation may be. And that reallocation has to move simply beyond saying that this is going to reduce deadweight loss to say who is going to win, who is going to lose. Is there going to be an overall economy-wide improvement in efficiency? And if so, can those benefits be channeled to placate the losers? Is there a risk that any reform we push through will simply be ignored because it goes against the very deep and powerful political incentives facing the counterparts that we work with? And finally, is there a risk that this kind of reform may actually be destabilizing or, in a worst case, lead to violence because a powerful actor feels that they are being sufficiently disadvantaged that they no longer have a stake in the continuation of the system, or they're willing to mobilize violence to protect their stake in the system? I think those questions are the kind of questions that lots of the economists I work with think about and can answer. I think it's about kind of formalizing this into our practice and thinking about it more systemically. But I think those are really the key questions we should be asking about any kind of reform in countries that are at risk of this kind of violence or instability.
Tobias, there's been a lot of recent focus on countries moving towards more inclusive institutions. Look at the 2024 Nobel Prize winners. Your research offers a slight warning, perhaps, or a caution, perhaps, towards that, right? So trying to eliminate elite patronage too quickly can lead to violence, can lead to instability, and that instability can be very costly for countries in terms of growth and development. Does your work suggest that for fragile states, then, the ideal of a rent-free economy is a goal we can only achieve after we've secured peace and stability?
So look, I think that the current focus on institutions is very valuable. I think that some of the work that gets a bit neglected in this discussion is some of the earlier work, including that done by Douglas North, the Limited Access Order Framework, that came out about 2010, that book, Violence and Social Orders, and Mushtaq Khan's Political Settlements book, which also came out about 2010. And I think their way of thinking about institutions, at least to me, is a little bit more nuanced and I think a little bit more useful, because it's fine to come to a country and say, hey, look, you should have open institutions. But that assumes that elites have an incentive and a willingness and a capacity to create those institutions and enforce those institutions. I think where Kahn and North come in is by saying actually institutions emerge from these very long-run historical processes through which over time elites who are stuck in this very complicated repeat game. Over time, they realize that the best way to grow the economy and maximize their own self-interest, maximize their own returns, is by institutionalizing property rights, institutionalizing individual rights, institutionalizing the underpinnings of a free market economy. Right? So over time, if you have sufficient stability, if elite planning horizons can be sufficiently extended, elites begin to see that actually fighting all the time is a bit of a waste. It's a bit of a pain. Having massive distortions in your economy, yes, it helps you keep the elite bargain together, but we'd be able to actually all get richer if we eliminated some of those distortions. And over time, and there's going to be decades or centuries, if elites can reach that conclusion that actually we are all served, that elites are served, that elites have an interest in having an impersonal state that can enforce property rights and can operate neutrally between elites, we all have an incentive in having that. That is what North calls the doorstep conditions for an open access order, for a liberal, democratic, market-based economy. But if we come in before elites see they have an incentive of that, then you're very unlikely to be successful. You're imposing an institutional system, or trying to impose an institutional system, in which, frankly, the people with the guns don't welcome that institutional system. And if the people with the guns don't welcome an institutional system, it's going to be very hard to enforce that system. So I think I've given a very long answer and perhaps a not very clear answer to your question, Richard, but I think the point is to say that, yes, unless elites want open access institutions, liberal, democratic, market-based institutions, unless they see themselves as having an interest in the establishment and sustainment of those institutions, it's going to be very hard for any external actor to come in and introduce them. Because at the end of the day, it's local political elites that have the coercive power to see those institutions implemented and enforced. And if that elite consensus is not there, what we end up having is a situation like in Afghanistan or other FCD countries, where you have thousands of pages of legislation and regulation that are very adherent to international good practice, that look very good on paper, but have very limited and very distorted bearing on what happens in the real world, because elites act with impunity in ignoring those rules and those regulations and those pieces of legislation.
So just to come in, Tobias, I want to ask you a bit of an unfair question based on around Afghanistan. There was about 20 years worth of assistance and external influence in Afghanistan, which ultimately failed, right, in terms of with the Taliban taking over and the undoing of a lot of the progress that was made. With the benefit of hindsight and with the benefit of some of the frameworks, some of the ideas which Douglas North, Mustar Khan, and yourself have been promoting, how might external actors, Western actors, approach Afghanistan differently over that 20-year period, which could have had more chance of success? What were the big things that could have been done differently?
So, Rich, I love that you put me in the same sentence as Douglas North and Mustar Khan for starters. So thank you for that. But I think that let me restrain my answer to the kind of economic side of this, because I think that there's a whole lot that can be said about security engagement. There's a whole lot that can be said about the original political bargaining, which I'm probably not the right person to speak about. But I think on the economic side, what would have perhaps been useful is for us to more systematically think about how the economy was interacting with politics, to think more systematically about the kind of resource flows that were serving a purpose and mobilizing support of elites, and being a little bit more careful when thinking about which rent flows and resource flows would be affected by the kind of standard economic reforms that we were often prescribing. Now, I'm not saying that if we'd done that, the outcome would have been different. I think the outcome in Afghanistan was overdetermined. There was no one solution to what happened there. But as a narrow answer to your question, I think what I'm saying is if we had a bit more of a strategy in terms of the economic reforms that were being pursued, and we'd been able to work with government to develop that kind of strategy. And that strategy had recognized that economic efficiency was one objective, but that objective had to be moderated with a broader objective of maintaining a political coalition and making the necessary compromises to do so. That may have helped at the margin. Let me make one more, just a bit of an aside. But, I think we should also be careful in terms of saying what was a failure and what was a success in Afghanistan. If you look at human development outcomes in Afghanistan over those 20 years, if you look at the number of girls in schools, if you look at the increase in average life expectancy, if you look at the number of children that were immunized and frankly, lives saved over that period, there were enormous successes there as well. And I think that's why we have to make a bit of a distinction between development in terms of providing things to people who are in need versus development in terms of broad society-wide structural reengineering, right? And I think we achieved some really good things in Afghanistan on the former. It's on the latter where things did not work out quite as well as anyone had hoped. And I think that there are some really important interactions, obviously, between the development, the security, and the political side there as well, which complicated the entire situation.
Thank you very much, Tobias. So you had mentioned in a previous article about the efforts to implement OECD-style public finance management system in fragile states as pushing on a string. So where exactly do these standardized systems break down? Is the key failure a lack of rules or a lack of the institutional underpinnings to enforce them, or is it something more?
Thank you for that. I mean, this is a paper I wrote, I think, quite a long time ago. I think it's 2015 or something like that. And I think the argument I was really making there was we seem to have this implicit intervention logic often when it comes to public finance reform in fragile states. We often believe that if we change the formal rules, those formal rules will be followed. That will lead to improvement in the functionality of PFM systems. And the improvement in PFM systems will lead to improved development and economic outcomes. And what I tried to do in that paper was challenge those critical links, twofold. Firstly, to say, as we've already talked about, changing the rules does not necessarily change outcomes in FCB contexts. And if nobody has an incentive to follow the rules and nobody has the power to enforce the rules, you can have the most beautiful PFM system in the world on paper, but it's not actually going to impact how the PFM system works because no one will be following the rules, right? So I think that's one part of where this breakdown occurs. And I think we need to think more systematically about which rules are going to be followed when and whether it is realistic to expect positive changes from alterations to formal systems if rules are simply not being followed. I think the second part of this, which is perhaps more challenging in some ways, is to say that often even if the overall PFM system improves, are we going to see better outcomes? And I think that a lot of what PFM is about is structuring decision-making and making decisions transparent and visible to the public. Right. So PFM is essentially, if you think it through, if you kind of drill down, it's saying that certain people should make certain types of decisions, and those decisions should be subject to public scrutiny, either directly by the public or through Parliament, representatives of the public. What that is heavily reliant on is this long route accountability, right? It's saying that essentially your policymakers, the people in charge of the government, care what their citizens think. They care what the citizens' views of them are. And that those citizens' views of political elites will be shaped by their performance in managing the economy and managing the government. Now, that may be halfway true in an OECD country, but in many fragile states, firstly, the government may not care at all what people's popular perceptions of the government are. Secondly, people in power may be able to buy support from the public through delivering patronage rather than jobs or handouts or benefits or infrastructure projects or the assorted procurement opportunities in their region. That may be how you mobilize public support rather than through policy performance or economic performance. And if that is the case, if those in charge of government are not being held accountable by the public for their performance in running the government, then the whole system breaks down. Because what you're doing is you're making decisions transparent and you're making decisions visible to citizens and their representatives. But there is no feedback loop between how people perceive those decisions and the incentives facing political elites. Political elites can continue to do what they want because they know they're going to win the election, whether they're perceived as corrupt or not, whether they're perceived as running the economy well or not. They know they're going to win the election because they can distribute patronage to their followers, or because they are a representative of a regional grouping or an ethnic grouping that is bound to have that level of support from a particular ethnic group or regional grouping or class grouping or whatever else. So if policymakers, if those in charge of government are not held accountable for policy performance and economic performance, then you can have the best public finance system in the world, and that's not necessarily going to translate into Vietnam.
So, Tobias, help me out here. If we've got this gap between electoral accountability, what's the most effective mechanism then for getting improvements in public service efficiency or public service delivery? How do we do it then if that link is broken?
Yeah, and look, I should say none of this is to say we shouldn't pursue transparency, and none of this is to say that core public finance reforms are not important. They can be, and I don't think there's necessarily an inconsistency there, and I think that's for two reasons. Sometimes public finance reforms fail because they are pushing up against elite incentives and the interests of powerful actors. And it's in those contexts that I think that outcomes tend to lag and we don't tend to see the results that we want. But often public finance is much less big picture than that. It's much more in the weeds of saying, look, do we have an adequate accounting system to know where the money's going? Can we prevent petty corruption? Do we have at least enough information so that policymakers can allocate resources in a way that they think is sensible? There is nothing in the big picture that prevents benefits from being accrued from those more technocratic changes, right? So again, I think there's a difference between big social scale re-engineering and big accountability loops and basically providing a functional plumbing system that allows governments to get money where it needs to be when they need it, right? And so I think a lot of gains can be achieved just by providing that basic plumbing system. And I think a lot of the dialogue around, basics first and PFM somehow reflects this, right? You just want to have a basic system of control, and that's a foundation for anything else you want to do in public finance. The second entry point, so I think there's a lot that can be done just in terms of waste, avoiding petty waste, petty corruption, petty leakage, mistaken resource reallocation that doesn't serve any political process. It's just a function of a broken system, right? So I think those technical fixes are useful and effective pretty much in any political context. I think the second thing is that I don't think accountability is entirely exogenous to what we do, right? And I think development actors can play an important role in putting the information out there. And the hope is that by putting that information out there over time, you build that kind of accountability. There is that kind of accountability there. There's that information there that over time leads to accountability, because people start to think, well, look, should I be voting for this politician based on the fact that he gave me a bag of rice or an outward motor? Or should I be voting on this politician on the basis that he has failed to deliver or delivered major infrastructure projects that have created jobs and opportunities for the country? So, it would be a mistake, I think, for us to say, well, look, transparency and accountability don't matter at all because those accountability loops are missing. Those accountability loops are only going to be built if there is some information in the ecosystem to start with. And then I think, development actors do have a role in supporting civil society. They have a role in supporting think tanks that fill in those gaps, right? That structure that information, that fill in the public dialogue between budget transparency and budget towards political accountability. So those links can be built over time. As I say, I think it's a very long run process. It's a process of decades. But we're never going to get there unless we start. And so I think that, the last thing I would want my work to be interpreted as saying is that we should give up on the whole thing. It's just saying we need to be strategic about our prioritization and have realistic expectations about what can be achieved and how fast.
So maybe if I set it out this way, right, you can have one set of thought which is at one extreme, which says, as international donors, as external actors in the system, you've got to be realistic, you've got to be pragmatic and accommodating. That may require turning a blind eye to certain things, that may require being laissez-faire when it comes to certain governance issues, but you accommodate and you look for the small incremental progress you can get in that reality. At the other side is a sort of international best practice, one size fits all, a model that we expect, a standards that we expect all countries to be able to meet. So if you've got those two ends of the spectrum, I hope I've sort of set it out as sort of in a useful way. Where would you see you fitting on that spectrum between international best practice, one set of stuff for every country, versus accommodating, adapting, blind eyes, laissez-faire, more pragmatic approach?
I think that's a great question. And the way I would think about it is that those things do not necessarily exist in conflict or do not have to exist in conflict. I think it would be a mistake to come to any country and say, look, here's the PIFA assessment, here's the international best practice, and we are going to impose that and try to apply that regardless of any of your local issues. That would clearly not be the right way to do public finance reform or any other kind of reform. But if you go to a finance minister in a very difficult country who is genuinely trying to do the right thing, and he's saying, look, I have an opportunity here to do some reform in terms of how the budget process works. And it's going to be difficult because there are some members of the government who are opposed to this, but I think this is the moment to push it through. When those moments open up, it's really, really useful to be able to go to international practice and say, we understand your problem. Here's 5 different ways other countries have addressed those problems. Here's what's worked internationally. Here's what's seen as being an effective solution to that problem, right? So the way I would think about that is using international best practice, but using it very selectively and using it when the problem is clearly identified and the solution matches the problem. So I think that's where the magic happens, right? So I don't think we need to throw out international good practice. I think we need to use it, we need to build it, but we need to make it land in countries in a way that is relevant and takes account of the constraints that our clients face. And my experience is that most people working on the ground here with whichever agency generally have a pretty good understanding of what those constraints are. And our clients have an excellent understanding of what those constraints are and are often quite good at explaining to us those constraints. So it's our ability to match the solution to the problem as it's articulated.
Thanks, Tobias. I would say you have even started to answer my next question because you have been advocating for a problem driven approach over standardized solutions. So, if you're advising a development agency today on a strategy in a fragile state, what would be the first step they should take that they are not currently doing? And that is to ensure that reforms don't unintentionally destabilize powerful elites.
Thanks for that. I think that's a great question, and what I would emphasize is that I think a lot of the steps that I would advocate are in fact taking place in a lot of development agencies and country offices around the world. I think people who do development well do exactly this. They try and firstly begin by understanding the problem. Then they try and make sure that they understand the political constraints, they understand the consequences of what any solution might mean, both from an economic perspective, but also from a political perspective or a social stability perspective. And then they think through with their client what solution is most likely to work in that given context. So I don't think it's necessarily me coming up and saying, look, here's something you need to do differently. But I think if there is a slight rebalancing, as Richard said, I think the more we can allocate, the more time and effort and resource we can allocate to understanding the context, to thinking through the problems, to mapping out the implications of different solutions, we are going to see better results. And the more that we can make sure that we're tailoring our advice and we're tailoring our solution to local settings, the better. And that's what I think we should be focusing on. And I think that's what, a lot of the development dialogue over the past 2 decades has really emphasized as well.
So thank you, Tobias. Tell us what your book is called and why should anyone buy it and where can we buy it from?
Oh, thanks, Richard. It's the name of the book is Public Finance, Conflict and International Interventions. The subtitle is How Good Governance Reforms Can Weaken State Building. It's available from Routledge, so you can get it from the website, and it's also available on Amazon. And why would you want to buy it? I think there's a lot there that really, I think, distills some theoretical discussions in a way that is very practical for development workers. So it's taking some of these very high-level theories from, as I said, Mushtaq Khan, Douglas North, and others, and it's trying to distill them in a way and say, look, how does this actually play out on the ground for people working on public finance and economic reform in the practical reality of fragile state settings? People who are interested in the case study countries, Solomon Islands, Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, may also enjoy it just to get a bit of a view of what happened with public finance reforms and how the public finance reforms interacted with the broader political context, which I spent a lot of time trying to research and understand and talk to a lot of people about. And maybe it's just another contribution to the long ongoing battle that many of us have been fighting, just encouraging this kind of in-depth sociological and contextual understanding of the countries we work in and making the case that we need that kind of understanding and we need the resources to build that understanding in order for us to do our jobs.
Thank you very much, Tobias.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you very much, Tobias.
Okay. Before we get into in depth about what Tobias was talking to us about, Favor, you asked in one of your questions and you referenced pushing on a string. And I really struggled to conceptualize what that analogy means in practice. What do you think it means and where were you coming from with that?
Yes, so actually I had gotten the phrase from an essay of his that I read, and he was talking about in relation to public finance management, that when we want to put these reforms into place or these policies, that it can amount to pushing on a string. And trying to understand that, it was like, okay, maybe you have a thin strand, like a thread, and then you are trying to push it along. It only works if you pull. Like, it only works if you have a piece of thread and you pull. But pushing is either you get nowhere or the string ends up bunching up. And so I think referencing that and looking at what he was saying, and even our interview, trying to say that pushing on a string when you're trying to push public finance management systems or reforms, when there's no capacity for it, when there's no even appetite for it, because we talked about the fact that you want people to care about accountability. You want them to care that they are politicians or they are public leaders, because they should vote for them because of reforms or based on policies. But what if what is holding a system in place is that bag of rice that they are sharing? And so how can you begin to ask people to care for something when it hasn't fallen within their purview yet? So I think that was what he was trying to get through. And as somebody living in Nigeria, I really related to that aspect, because although a lot of things are changing right now, I can really admit that people do care what their leaders do. But before, it was a matter of, okay, how many bag of rice, or they promise to build a road or borehole or light, something that they're supposed to actually be doing on a regular basis, but then they elicit them. So when you come to meet community people like that and tell them, oh, care about their manifesto or care about their policy or care about their track record, it becomes a matter of pushing on a string, which would take you nowhere, essentially.
Yeah, Favor, I completely understand that. And having worked on public financial management reforms in Nigeria, it can sometimes feel like you have two rival systems that are running at the same time, right? You have the sort of patronage system where a lot of the energy goes to, particularly in the run up to elections, where it is about sharing bags of rice. It is about sharing money sometimes to win elections, and all sorts of public service delivery and all the rest of it gets put to one side for a very basic level meeting of human needs, right? Here's a bag of rice. Here's some cash. And often I think that runs alongside a system where we're trying to get improvements in the public financial management that the country's doing as well. So we're trying to say, right, well, there's some unaccounted for revenues here, or there's leakage here. Money's been wasted. Money's been sometimes fraudulently used, sometimes taken away. How can we stop that? How can we prevent that from happening? And we're trying to block off. And having this two-tiered approach can be really difficult to handle at the same time, because there's one part of me which is like, nobody wants to see these resources wasted. Nobody wants to see these resources used for lining the pockets of various elite interests. People want the money to serve the people. People want the money to go through there. But then at the same time, it's like, well, what's the point in strengthening a system, putting a new form in place, putting a new check and balance, increasing transparency, if all that then serves to do is undermine stability, and then progress becomes even less likely. And so it's a tension, I think, that lives in the development work we do, not just in the very fragile states like Afghanistan, but also in the slightly more stable states, the sort of Pakistans, Nigerias of the world, where there's enough stability that you're not fearing complete collapse of the state or whatever, but you also know that things are being held together by various pacts between interest groups, whether that's regional, which often is the case in Nigeria, whether it's about elite groups as it is in Pakistan. But it's how it's holding that tension and trying to navigate a way through without collapsing the stability that you have. And that really is what good development practitioners are trying to, that's the space good development practitioners are trying to work in. And the naive development practitioners are the ones who are just coming in there saying, right, okay, here's a gap here, let's try and plug it. And they're not looking at that broader political economy. I'm reminded of the Peter Evans type episodes that we had previously, where we did look at the political economy and we did look at how that played through. But I think what Tobias is really focusing on is when we get to the most basic element of all of this, which is, can you have that enough peace and stability in order to actually make developmental progress? And if we push too far, that can collapse. Finally, pushing on a string, I think going back to analogies that work best for me. So maybe perhaps to bring it into our own lives, we can think of it a bit like if you've got a friend who's maybe going through some addiction or some challenging moment in their life and they're really at rock bottom. And, you could come to them as a friend trying to push for the very best for them, right? And say, right, you've got to show up to work. You've got to get out of this challenge that you're facing. You've really got to face your responsibilities and do all that, and you really insist on that on a friend. The risk with that is that your friend feels to some degree that you're not meeting them in the challenge that they're at, right? And you're not meeting them at the level they're in, and they don't feel that empathy, they don't feel that support that perhaps they need at that time. The other extreme is that you go straight into where they're at and you say, "Oh God, you're going through such a hard time," and it looks, if it was a alcohol addiction or something like that, "Oh, can I get you another drink?" or something. You don't want to be that person either, do you? You don't want to be the one which is accommodating the stuck situation that your friend has. And so, in a way, it's about finding that middle ground where you're pushing your friend as best you can to make those improvements, to make those positive next steps, to get them out of their situation without just pushing so hard then that you break that relationship and then you then become untrusted. And I think, again, that's what it comes down to with countries as well, and public financial management, economic reforms. You want to be pushing for progress. You want to be pushing for improvements. You don't want to just be accepting corruption and tolerating, where funds are being looted and vested interests. But you've got to understand that that's the starting point, and you've got to understand that expecting too much too soon can be destabilizing and can break down the whole thing. So you've got to be pushing for managing things. Again, I've used this analogy so many times on the podcast. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? How do you, no endorsement of eating elephants again, but here, how do you get that progress? You don't get progress through big bangs. You don't get progress from expecting someone to go to 0 to 100. You get progress by steady, incremental progress, one step at a time, one bite at a time, if it's the elephant. I know you want to say something about the elephant, Favor.
Yes, I wanted to say that I've spoken about eating the elephant so many times that it kind of sounds like we should just eat an elephant. I'm just kidding. No animals were hurt in the production of this episode.
Flywheel
But yes,
Economics does not endorse the eating of elephants, by the way. We're a big fan of
agreed.
elephants.
Agreed. Agreed. So I think just other takeaways from this episode, you spoke about the political economy, and I'm seeing that sometimes they can be so deeply intertwined, both politics and economy, and it's the place of development professionals or anybody really to really understand that connection and not run away from it. In our previous episode with Peter J. Evans, and even I think Tobias spoke a bit about that, like, oh, we want to run away because it's a bit uncomfortable. But this analysis must be done and it must be understood. And I'm really a big fan of the economists that won the 2024 prize that's in economics, because they talk about the fact that inclusive institutions are the drivers for prosperity in a country. And so asking that question to Tobias was like, we know that it's important for inclusive institutions. So how can we get fragile states to be in that point? And his answer was very humbling in the sense that it gets to a point where we have to realize that the elites have to be the one to one day realize that, oh, this our corruption doesn't pay, or the violence that we use doesn't pay. But we must now realize that it's going to be a long journey. As an idealist, we know that it's not going to happen overnight. Maybe to take them decades or a century to realize, "Ah, we're on the wrong path here. Let's just actually do things the right way." But in the meantime, while we wait for them to come to this realization by themselves, why we, as Richard just said, not push to the point of breaking, how can we ensure that the people that are living in these countries, just like the work that was done in Afghanistan, even though some people might want to argue that, oh, maybe it was a failure, it was a waste of time. But as Tobias said, we did see some metrics in terms of women education. We did see things were actually improving. So it's a way of working within a situation that is not working.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the Nigeria example, right? And if we think about some of the big economic reforms that have recently been taken, whether that's the fuel subsidy removal, whether that's the adjusting of the exchange rates to reflect the weakening of the naira, these are all really hard things for citizens to take, right? And if you look, what are the benefits that citizens feel from government? Well, there's the patronage benefits, right? It's when elections come and bags of rice are shared and money is given out and all the rest of it. The sort of the stuff which is not really part of the formal system, but is part of how the reality of how politics sometimes operates in countries similar to Nigeria. There's also the little tangible benefit people were getting from the formal system, which was cheap fuel, relatively cheap fuel. And so when that goes, it's how do you then build the trust and the confidence of the citizens that there's something else to go? Because it was a very wasteful expenditure, the fuel subsidy. If you want to give benefit to people, this is a very expensive and very inefficient way of giving benefits to people. But then if there's no alternative where people are feeling the benefits, then you're taking away the little that people felt that they had from the dynamic. And so this is why when we're talking about a phased approach, it's making sure that you build that confidence that the official systems can provide things which are useful to citizens whilst you're doing that reform, and not expecting them to take it on trust or hope alone that those things will come down the line. And I think that's perhaps a learning point on the big economic reforms, right? Is how can you bring it in? How can you bring in those effective cash transfer schemes and social protection schemes? How can you bring in better education, better healthcare for citizens so that they see tangible improvements? That when you're taking away the inefficient benefit people are getting, the one which was basically providing cheap fuel to the whole of West Africa, that you can then also replace that you've got the confidence that the other systems can provide as well. And so it's not just about systems like Afghanistan, where it's the risk of countries falling or countries being taken over by extremists like the Taliban, but it's also countries like Nigeria as well, where it's more practical kind of economic reforms and how you keep the public on board with those reforms too. So many different dimensions we can look at what Tobias was sharing, the lessons that came out of that, so many thoughts that have been prompted. And I'm really delighted that we were able to get him on the show to share his insights. Favor, I don't know, any final reflections from you before we wrap up?
None from me. Just to say thank you to Tobias. As I said, it was really an eye-opening conversation for me, and a lot to take away and a lot to reflect on. Thank you very much for coming. And to our dear listeners, thank you very much. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode. Don't forget, you can share your thoughts with us by leaving a comment on our social media pages. Our handle across board is Flywheel Economics. And also for the Flywheel Economics podcast, we would love to have you subscribe, like wherever you listen to your podcast, whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or wherever else. So please come along this journey with us. Subscribe so you can get notified immediately if our episode drops. If you're interested and want to go more in depth into the work that we do here, please visit our website at flywheeleconomics.com. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics Podcast.